Okay, let's get started today, everyone. I'm going to see if I can get into the lounge myself, because if I'm in the lounge, I can tell if other people are there. Glad to see it's getting fixed or been fixed. Class schedule. There we go. Nope, still says team's looking into the issue. So at any rate, if anyone is in the lounge, I welcome you. I can't see you or tell you're there, but I welcome you anyway. And John, our TA, is here, and John will get to know everything he wants to know about this topic because he's the only person here. So we're going to talk today about walking the Camino de Santiago. I'm going to share my screen with you. And hopefully you see something that says walking the Camino de Santiago. Do you see that, John?
Yeah, perfect.
And if someone joins, let me know because I don't see any participants, but we'll go ahead and start. I'm going to begin with a quote from Sister Joan Chittister, a well-known writer and Benedictine. She said, "The dreams that determine the ultimate quality of our life never die, are never too late to be grasped." In 2018, shortly after I turned 61, I went to Spain for 6 weeks to walk 500 miles on one of the oldest pilgrimage routes in Europe, the Camino de Santiago. I walked a particular route of the Camino known as the Camino Frances, or the French route, French way. And it was a dream I'd had for nearly 20 years. That's me there in the middle in red. I'm always the guy in red. A pilgrimage is a journey to a sacred place or shrine, or it could be any long journey or search, especially one of exalted purpose or moral significance. That's why we don't typically talk about any journey or any trip or any vacation or anything like that being a pilgrimage. We usually save it for special reasons. And pilgrims discover that often it's about the journey and not the destination. In other words, the journeying itself, getting there, was more important or as important as arriving. In the Middle Ages, there were hundreds of pilgrimage destinations. They were typically, but not always, cathedrals. Cathedrals often housed the remains or the burial place of a saint, or they had some relic of a saint, even a bone, a finger bone. The most famous of those was in Canterbury in England. As a high schooler, we all had to read the Canterbury Tales. It was in Middle English. It was pretty difficult to struggle through, but we read it, and that's where we first learned about the fame of Sir Thomas of Becket, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury and was slain. He was martyred in the cathedral by King Henry II. His burial place became a shrine and a destination of pilgrimage, and hundreds and thousands walked across England every year to go there. But that's in England. That was the one that maybe many people in America are familiar with, but there were hundreds of those across Europe in the Middle Ages. And pilgrimage to sacred places is probably older. I think that something like Stonehenge was probably a pilgrimage destination. Why do I think that? Because they found what appear to be ceremonial avenues leading to it and from it and branching out in different places. Stonehenge is actually in the middle of what's known as the Salisbury Plain, a big wide open plain or flat place in southwestern central England. And there are hundreds of sacred sites across there, not just Stonehenge. So it was a sort of a sacred landscape. And people probably came there at certain times of the year. The stones and the standing stones and their placement is of particular significance. Now, the Camino de Santiago in particular, Santiago de Compostela was thought to be the burial place of the Apostle James, who was one of the original followers of Jesus. And people have been walking to Santiago to see his burial place for like 1,200 years. And in the Middle Ages, so like from around, say, 1,000 to 12 or 1,300, up to 500,000 people walk there and back home every year. It was, for a time, the most popular pilgrimage destination in all of Europe. Before that, it had been Jerusalem or Rome. But when especially Jerusalem was closed off because of the Crusades and the fighting between the Crusaders and the Muslim occupiers or rulers of the area. They hadn't always been in conflict, but they were for a particular time. And pilgrims couldn't go to Jerusalem. So Santiago actually became the most sought after place. And part of that is because of the infrastructure and the places built along the way for pilgrims to stay. I personally went on this pilgrimage for a spiritual reason, as a way to reset my life as I entered a new stage being plus 60 years old. I went by myself. That means no one else in my family, no friends went with me. I walked solo, but I met hundreds of other pilgrims because the path is every day populated with hundreds of pilgrims walking the same section that you are. And thankfully, also nicely, my wife joined me for the last week. So she joined me for the last 100 kilometers or so. To get an idea of the map of the way of St. James, that's the Camino de Santiago, and the French way, you imagine Europe kind of like a giant funnel. So all of Europe spreading out wide and kind of funneling down narrowly to some passes over the Pyrenees. So the Pyrenees Mountains are the border between France and Spain, have always been, still are. Of course, in the Middle Ages, this was more like a single kingdom. The kingdom of I've my name. It's quick for just a second. It's escaping me. But anyway, it was more a united kingdom, and wasn't two separate nations. Spain and France didn't exist as nations as they are now in the Middle Ages. And pilgrims would come from all over Europe. They come from England, and France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Switzerland. And they would gather chiefly in 4 cities: Paris, Vézelay, Le Puy, and Arles. And there they would wait for other pilgrims to get together, and they would travel as groups. And the reason being that it's safer in the travel in a group in the Middle Ages, because travel was kind of risky and dangerous. So it was safer to travel with others. They would gather there, then they would take these routes, which these could be up to 500 miles long themselves across France, maybe 300-400 miles across France. And then as they funneled down, they would gather in this little town right here, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and then head across Spain. There are many routes going along the northern coast coming up from other places in Spain, but this one, the Camino Frances, or the French way, this is a little more detail of it. This was the most popular. It was maybe the easiest to walk because there aren't as many mountain ranges. You have to cross 3 mountain ranges, so it's not easy necessarily, but the broad, flat Spanish plain, the Meseta, it goes roughly from before Burgos all the way past Leon. So almost a third of it to a half of it is the Meseta, or the broad, flat Spanish plain. Each of these little dots represents a city or town where there's a place to stay. And these were all places to stay. In the Middle Ages, people stayed there on pilgrimage, and pilgrims stayed in the pilgrim hostels. They called them hospitals, where they got hospitality, a bed to sleep in or a place to sleep, and some food, and they could go on the next day. And these towns still exist. Many of them were broken down over the centuries as the interest in pilgrimage declined. But when there was a modern resurgence of interest in the Camino de Santiago starting in the 1980s, a lot of these towns sprang back to life, and they've reconstructed the buildings. And now each year they have again nearly 500,000 people walking along it. In preparation for my pilgrimage, I developed a set of 7 principles that I would keep in mind as I walked. Number 1, I will try to average about 25 kilometers or 15 miles per day. Number 2, I will make no reservations for lodging. I will simply accept whatever accommodations are available when I reach a destination. That's one of the beauties of walking the Camino de Santiago, that you don't have to make reservations ahead of time. Pilgrim accommodations, which are usually called albergues, of which I will say more, are low cost or free, but you have to be a pilgrim to stay there. You can't be just anybody driving up there by car wanting to find an inexpensive place to stay. Number 3, I will not be in a hurry. I'll remind myself of this constantly. I came from a very busy job, a very hurried lifestyle, and I wanted to slow down. Number 4, I will carry my pack the whole way. I will be forced to keep the contents light. You can hire a pack service, which will carry, will transport your pack from one town to the next. But I wanted to carry my pack, and that meant that I would learn simplicity by having fewer things. Number 5, I will walk the entire way, no taking taxis or buses, but buses between towns. The idea was to keep moving and to not get discouraged, but to feel like I could keep going. Number 6, I would make it a priority, since I'm not in a hurry, to slow down and listen for the voice of God speaking around me or through those whom I meet. These are the signs. And number 7, I will accept within reason whatever's offered me as a gift from God. So I kind of set off with these principles in mind. And my pilgrimage began as any other pilgrimage begins when I crossed the threshold of my house. That was early spring, March 27, 2018. It was actually it was a chilly day, in the upper 30s, raining. There was light snow still up in the woods behind my house. I took a bus to Dulles Airport, and from Dulles Airport, I took a plane. I flew to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, and from there, I took a train to the town of Bayonne. And at Bayonne, I picked up a bus that took me to this place, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, which I showed you on the map before, which was where a lot of pilgrims start their 500-mile or 800-kilometer pilgrimage across Spain on the French way, or the Camino Frances. Saint-Jean is a lovely town, still has the feel of the Middle Ages, and a very distinct Basque culture, because it is in the heart of French Basque territory. When you cross over the mountains, you are in Spanish Basque territory. The first night I stayed in an albergue where we had a nice communal meal, and there were like about 20 of us, and we paused for a picture. We were all setting off the next day. Some were going to walk the whole distance like I was. Some were going to walk part of the way. Some didn't know how far they were going to go, but it was a great time sitting around the table, getting to know one another, finding out where we were from, and getting a sense of our purpose in being there. Mine was to walk the whole 500 miles over the course of 6 weeks in one go. When you were a pilgrim, you need to carry this thing, which is a credential or a pilgrim passport. Every day when you stop somewhere or stay somewhere, you get a stamp on your credential like this. And when you get a stamp in the credential, that the place you stay stamps it and they date it. And that, number one, this credential says you are a pilgrim, so that allows you to stay in these inexpensive pilgrim lodging or albergues. And also, when you get to your final destination in Santiago, you use these the stamps. They look at that in the pilgrim office, and they see, yeah, you started on a certain day, and they can see all the places along the way you stopped, and they can tell you walk the whole way. So they give you something called a compostela, or a certificate of completion. You always take off walking through this little gate right here, Santa Maria Maddalena Church. And this is the clock tower in the city. You can see it was about 9:35 in the morning. There's a picture of me, took a selfie, getting ready to start out on the pilgrimage, leaving Saint-Jean. And the first day I walked, it occurred to me that I had all the time in the world and nothing to do but walk. So my life became walking. You can see it's an early spring day. The fields are all beautiful green, but there aren't many leaves on the trees, if any. First day I climbed over the Pyrenees. It was about 24 kilometers. It was maybe about 800 meters in climbing. So it's quite a bit of climbing along highway that wasn't busy, or a road, asphalt road, but also a lot of it through a path through a forest. This is a famous pass called the Ibaneta Pass, where the armies of Roland, who was one of the commanders of Charlemagne in the 9th century, crossed over the mountains to try to free northern Spain from the Moors, who ruled Spain then. He was slain near here after a battle. I think 778 says right here is the year he died. So actually it's 8th century. And this marker memorializes Roland. So you can see there's still some slight snow in the mountains. It was early spring still. In fact, I would see light snow in several places. I arrived in this place called Roncesvalles, which is a medieval monastery was built to host pilgrims in like the 13th century and has been hosting pilgrims ever since then. There was a time when many fewer people walked to Santiago, maybe just a trickle every year. But when the resurgence of the Camino began in the 1980s, places like this refurbished themselves. And today, I think, I don't know, 200 pilgrims can stay there at a night. There's kind of the road going through the foothills of the Pyrenees. When you leave Roncesvalles on day number 2, you can pause near this sign that says Santiago de Compostela, 790 kilometers away. So you can see it's still a long ways to go. I carried a 38-liter pack weighing about 16 pounds the whole way as a lesson in simplicity. So that's my pack with my stuff loaded in it. And there's my poles, because poles, you can see I'm pausing to hold them right here. They're great for walking. They do a couple things. They keep you upright. So if you're on a slippery or steep slope, you can't slip or slide up or down because your poles are there to support you. If you're on a level surface and it's muddy, they keep you upright. They also help you climb hills because you can use your arms to kind of push your body up, kind of like having four limbs. And lastly, they take, when you're just walking on the flat, poles can take 30% of the pressure off your joints. So they're a real vital thing for me, at least, to walk in. I got up most mornings before first light, and I walked for an average of about 5 hours a day. So I usually, left around 7 in the morning and arrived at my destination with a couple of stops, maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon. There is the moon setting as I'm heading west one morning. I typically stop mid-morning for some more cafe con leche. That's, like the cappuccino, and maybe a sweet bread or something called the Spanish tortilla to eat an extra breakfast. An albergue is a hostel for pilgrims, and you get a bed or a bunk for a fixed cost between 6 and 10 euros per night, with access to a bathroom and a place to wash your clothes and maybe more. Albergues vary considerably. Some are run by municipalities and can sleep more than 150 people per night. Whoops. Let's go back here. I misspelled and let's back that up. There we go. Any comments or questions so far? John? I don't know if anybody in the lounge has a question. You certainly are welcome to ask one. Put your question in the chat.
Hey Russ, no, we have no question in the lounge as well.
Very good. John, your voice got higher.
This is Emma here. Can you hear me now?
I hear you, Emma. Just
Yeah,
teasing
hey
you.
Russ. We have no
Pilgrims are
question
asked
in
to
the
remove
lounge
their...
as well.
Pardon me? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm saying we have no question in the lounge.
Okay. How many people out in the lounge?
Yes, we have.
Okay. Pilgrims are asked to remove their shoes when they enter an albergue. So this is actually an albergue that's in an old parish. The kind of the rectory for an old parish church is probably about 700 years old. Look how thick those walls are. Those walls are about 3 feet thick. But everybody's got to leave their shoes because they've been walking in mud or dirt that day. And so you got to have sandals or something, flip-flops, to walk around in the evening. When you arrive in an albergue, my practice always was to lay down for just a couple of minutes to rest my feet. And then I got up and I took a shower. Then I hand washed my clothes because I only had two sets of clothes, the ones I was wearing, and another clean set in my pack. So I washed my clothes out by hand, hung them up to dry, and then then put on my clean clothes. I'm just trying to see what the chat is in the chat here. Any question in the chat? Okay. In an albergue like this one, they also have a communal meal. So all the pilgrims staying there that night can eat together. Typically, often the pilgrims will help make the meal and help do the cleanup when it's done. I think there were 52 of us sitting around these 2 long tables. There might have been a third table that night. Pilgrims from around the world eating a pretty simple supper. I think mostly vegetarian. I think it's probably some kind of lentil soup and some salad and bread. Really good. I'm sitting here, and the fellow to my right here is an American named Peter, who was 74 years old. He was walking the Camino de Santiago for like the third time. There's a custom in Spain. They get these carafes that hold wine, and they have like a spout in it. And of course, people like to try to see if they can pour it back, tip it back, and get it to pour out into their mouth. Pilgrims sitting in a cafe in the afternoon, checking their guidebooks, planning their routes, maybe downloading an email, sending some photos to somebody. That night in that albergue where we had that communal meal, we also slept on the floor on mats that were about 3 inches thick. They're actually quite comfortable. No pillows. I brought along a sleeping bag. Always slept in a sleeping bag. Very lightweight, weighed about 2 pounds. And their albergues are heated, so it wasn't that cold at night. It wasn't so cold that my sleeping bag wasn't cold enough. But sometimes albergues, so they get a little bit cooler at night, they would have extra set of blankets that you could throw over your sleeping bag. Walking through the region of Spain is known as La Rioja, which is famous for its wines. You can see the vines were just starting to sprout in early spring. The fields are green, but off in the distance, there's a lot of snow up in the mountains. The Camino is full of magic or chance encounters that happen when you let go of schedules, plans, and control. You might walk solo, like these 3 people are actually all solo walkers like me, but you meet others along the way, and it's great to have conversation with new friends that you meet. You can see this is the path is adjacent to a highway. The old Camino de Santiago, the route that pilgrims would have taken in the Middle Ages, was probably along that paved road. That being unsafe for walkers, they very nicely put down a gravel path on the other side there where we are so that we could walk without cars. When you have a chance to have a lot of solitude and you have a chance for a lot of solitude, reflections, you can change the pace of your life when you're walking the Camino. Nothing I love better than coming over a short summit and seeing the road stretching out 4 miles. You can see it's like a ribbon going along this way through this village, and you can see it stretching out up over the plains, going off over that way. When you're walking in the evenings, I was a solo walker, but I got to know others and heard their stories when we stopped to be together in the evenings. This is an albergue run by the Confraternity of St. James, which is a British fraternal organization. They run this albergue in an ancient place. I think it was built in the 14th century. They completely rehabbed it, refurbished it, and then volunteers come and serve there for 2 weeks. They served us biscuits and tea in the afternoon. Another one of those communal meals. This one was in a parish house attached to a church. It was a donativo, meaning you stayed there and just left a donation. I always left a good donation, whatever was similar to what I'd be spending somewhere else for the night. Run completely by volunteers. That allows people who maybe can't afford it or can't afford as much to be able to stay there. This place, we had our meal together, and then we had a short service where we kind of talked about why we had come, and then we helped clean up. Another one of those communal meals in an albergue, big bowl of soup. Sometimes we had meals together in restaurants, and I got into an restaurant Heschel Hotel one evening, and there were a bunch of people I knew all around a table sharing a meal with one another. There's a typical mid-morning breakfast. The official Spanish breakfast is coffee and toast, so it's not much. So if you want a little bit more substantial, you stop again, have a café con leche. This is a Spanish tortilla right here, which is kind of like a quiche. It's got egg, onion, and potato with some bread, and of course, a delicious pastry. The route is marked with yellow arrows and the scallop shell. That's how you know where you're going. You don't need I had a guidebook with a map in it, but you don't have to have one. Sometimes the markers look like this. When you get to Galicia toward the end, there's a little brass plate in there that says how many kilometers it is from there to Santiago. Sometimes you have a homemade map like this one, Santiago, 518 kilometers. In the cities can be harder to navigate. They have to put the signs, the signage up, the markers pretty big on a wall so you don't miss it. Sometimes you're walking through a deep forest. It feels magical with moss and deep green trees overhanging the path. This is a section in the Meseta where it's very broad and flat, and you can see the road is almost as straight as can be. This is actually a restored Roman road. And if you want to know how the Romans built roads, they look just like this. They always had a ditch on the side for drainage. They built the road up a bit. There's usually a heavier stone surface underneath, and they have a gravel on top, well packed. And so as the roadway was built up slightly, so drainage could come off to the side. And the Romans always built their roads straight. What's unique about this road, you can see the road going off, completely vanishing in the horizon, but way in the very end, you can see a string of mountains. Those are that was a mountain range I was going to have to walk to and over. You go through some beautiful cities. This is Burgos, which is the largest city that you pass on the way, about 400,000 to 500,000 people. It has a very famous cathedral, you can see there. In early spring, as the time when I was walking, it was muddy, so you got to be prepared for walking in mud. There's another section of an old Roman road that gives you a bit more of the sense of the old underlayment that the Romans put on their roads. There's these are kind of leaning off to one side, and that side, then there's a straight line down the middle. That's kind of like the height of the road, the crown. Another section of restored Roman road. These guys are walking it the medieval way. They've got all their stuff on a donkey. That's the way to go. Let the donkey carry your stuff. And you pass through a lot of historic towns and villages. Castro Heriz with its famous church. One of the towns, small cities, actually, Ponferrada, has a castle of the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar, they're kind of famous from modern fiction, like the Da Vinci Code. They were actually a religious order of knights in the Middle Ages, and their task was to protect pilgrims. They started out protecting pilgrims on the route to Jerusalem, and when Jerusalem became closed off to pilgrims for about a century, they turned their task of protecting pilgrims to other routes, including the Camino de Santiago, and in Ponferrada, they built this castle. And it's still in existence, still in pretty good shape, looks like it did in the Middle Ages, and you can actually visit and take a tour during the day. When you get up in the morning and you're walking to the west, the sun comes up behind you in the east, and so it casts a very long shadow in the road ahead of you. This is the Puente la Reina, or Bridge of the Queen, in the town called Puente la Reina. It was a small village in the Middle Ages, pretty big river, and it was hard for pilgrims to get over this river. And so the queen, and there was a ferry, and the ferrymen, the ones that ran the ferry, were known to be kind of unscrupulous. And so the queen took pity on the pilgrims, and she had this bridge built so they could cross over the river without being robbed or fleeced or overcharged by the ferrymen. And millions of feet have crossed over this bridge in 800 years. There's another view of that bridge. One thing that's distinctive in these old bridges, you see there's where the pier is, there's kind of a point. This stack of stones comes to a point, and that prevents brush, which can gather around a bridge in a flood. And if you get too much brush, it can actually create sort of a dam, and then a big wall of water could theoretically push a bridge over it, because it happens. Sometimes the locals are enterprising, and they run little snack stands like this one right here on the right, which is by donation only. You can leave anything you want. He's got all sorts of snacks and foods there right in the middle of an olive grove. He's setting up a chair there on the left in an olive grove. And that olive grove and the path that is walking next to it is an old Roman path. It's been around for a few thousand years. There's another marker on the broad, flat meseta. This is the two symbols, the scallop shell and the yellow arrow. There's a famous bodega, or winery, in a town of Estella. And the Bodega Sirache, the Sirache is the name of the family. They give away 100, or sorry, they give away about 100 liters of wine every day. They put it into a big jug or big barrel, and you can open a tap on it right here and get some wine for free. A lot of pilgrims like to stop and get a glass. And again, more grapevines in the vineyards. You can see the snow in the mountains in the distance. The town of Moena Seca with its famous church. And of course, Leon, the most beautiful cathedral next to the one in Santiago. Big, open and airy with lots of light coming in. You have to take care of your feet when you're walking. It's easy to get blisters. Very good blister treatment is to put this runner's tape on your toes. When you start to feel them pre-blister, like we call it a hot spot, when your toe starts to burn a little bit, or it's a spot, maybe your heel starts to burn a bit, that's a blister coming on. You put some of that tape over it and you won't get a blister. Many of the towns and villages are still in, have fallen down, still need to be reconstructed, but a town like this is, they're slowly reconstructing and rebuilding the old places into cafes, restaurants, and hostels for pilgrims. One of those snack stands along the way that enterprising folks run for the sake of pilgrims. One of the high points, literally the high point, both figuratively and literally, on the Camino is a Cruz de Ferro. This is it. It's the tallest point, so it's the highest climb that you have to get over to get to Santiago. And that's a cairn or a pile of stones. It's been there for they don't know how long, thousands of years. Cairns were the ancient Celts would often mark a path with a cairn or pile of stones. And maybe the Romans carried on the tradition because the Romans would often lay a stone on top of an elevation or a height, drop a stone off as an offering to the god Mercury, who is the god of travelers. And maybe in the Middle Ages, other pilgrims drop stones here. They don't know why, but now modern pilgrims often bring a stone from home and leave it there as they're going by. There's some of the stones people have left with other things like shoes. After I've been walking for 4.5 weeks, my wife came and joined me. It was great to have Jane with me. This is us in Sadia, about 100 kilometers from the end. My first day of walking with her, she loved it. Galicia, which is northwest Spain, where Santiago is the Celtic region of Spain. A lot of people didn't know that Spain had a Celtic region. It actually is Celtic also in that it reminds me of Ireland. It can be wet and rainy. So you can see sometimes the Camino itself turns into a little stream. It's also full of magical forests of eucalyptus trees with a fantastic scent of eucalyptus. The eucalyptus is not native. It was brought to Galicia they hoped to make ship masts out of it. Turned out wasn't the best wood for ship masts. It tended to snap or break too easily, too brittle. And what they didn't know, though, was that the eucalyptus is an invasive species and grows very quickly, so it's spread all over the place. Even though it's beautiful, it is an invasive species. More of those famous bridges along the way. Coming into a town, walking through the woods. This is a famous drink in Galicia. You take some whiskey and you set it on fire, but first you throw some coffee beans in it. So the whiskey slowly, the alcohol burns away, and it begins to develop the flavor of coffee, and then you drink it. The people that run the cafes and bars along there are very friendly, love to meet pilgrims. There's Manuel, this guy here on the left here, is making this special drink with his daughter. Give my wife a big hug. My wife loved the great desserts that you could eat. On the left is a photo that seemed familiar to me the morning we were leaving. I had like a couple of days before we reached Santiago. I looked up and I saw the moon setting, and I said, wait, I've seen the moon setting before when I get up in the morning. And I realized it was 4 weeks before When I was leaving Punta Lorena, I'd seen the moon setting ahead of me as I walked, and I realized I'd been walking outside all day, every day for 4 weeks. That had become my life. That single shadow I showed you before now has got an accompanying shadow. My wife and I are now approaching the city of Santiago, our end point. You get to Mount Gonza, and it's the point where you can't quite see in this picture, but this is the cathedral off in the distance, several miles. And this is a traditional spot where a lot of pilgrims could get their first glimpse of the cathedral. And there is the cathedral after we walked into the city. Santiago is a beautiful city, probably the nicest of the cities that I crossed through, mostly because it doesn't really have an industrial area on the edge. It is a tourist city because people do come to the cathedral there. You can see these are all people that a tour group of some kind with their tickets hanging around their neck. I've heard that cruise ships dock off in the distance, and bus pilgrims, bus tourists to Santiago for the day. This is the north side of the cathedral. You come through a gate, and then you find yourself in the Western Plaza, and that's where pilgrims traditionally arrive from all different directions, having walked all the way, or hopefully walked all the way to Santiago. There's my wife and me on the right, with a woman on the left. Narelle is an Australian I'd met several weeks before walking on the Camino. When I met her, she told me that her husband was going to come and join her in Sadia. And I said, "Oh, really? When?" And she said, "April 28th. I said, "That's a great day. That's the same day my wife is going to meet me in Sadia." And when I walked over I didn't see her then for several weeks. And when I went to meet my wife at the bus station, there was Narelle. Her husband, Peter, got off the same bus from the airport that my wife got off of. This young woman in the middle is accompanied by her father. She walked the whole way from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, as I did, and her father came. She's German. Her father came and joined her, just like my wife came and joined me in Sadia, walking the last section. There we are in front of the cathedral. Was undergoing some renovations, so you see there's some big scaffolds over it, but it was a huge relief and a sense of accomplishment for me to have walked 500 miles over that 5-week stretch. We stayed in Santiago a few extra days. I picked up my certificate of completion here. That's the Compostela there on the left, and on the right is the certificate that says how many miles I'd walked or how many kilometers. And there's the end point there, our feet in Santiago. Up on the rooftop, there is one of the towers on the right, and there's a clock face on the left. What's nice about sticking around Santiago for a couple of days is people who are maybe a little bit behind you, but maybe you met somewhere along the way, are coming into the Santiago and completing their pilgrimage, like this woman Kate did, someone I met from Australia. And again, we walk around the city, bump into pilgrims that we've met in other places along the way. These are all folks I'd met along the way who were over 60, who were walked all or part of the way to Santiago. This guy over here in the far left, Carl, I met him actually the day that I arrived in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port to begin my pilgrimage. So I'd been bumping into him for 6 weeks. There's a famous rooftop tour you can take to go up to the roof of the cathedral. We took our time to go up there. If you imagine the roof is a dangerous place, it's not. See, they got big railings all around the edge. It's a very safe place. You get a fabulous view of the city and of the countryside around. A few more views of the towers above the cathedral. There's my walking poles after carrying me that whole way. And let me close with a quote also by Sister Joan Chittister. She says, "It is the fresh life within that age reveals to us if we only give it a chance. It is learning to give new challenges a chance that make the later years a spiritual adventure as well as a psychological stumbling block. Some of us meet its demands with the joy of the climb."